Well, thank you. I am Tom Davis, and that is Martin Frost. We were campaign chairman, respectfully. I was the House Republican campaign chairman in 2000 and 2002. Martin was the Democratic House campaign chairman in 1996 and 1998. So we never went head-to-head against each other, so we were friends. Let me just say a couple things. I've got some slides because I have a great belief that a picture is worth 1,000 words. But they talk about the dysfunction in Washington, and I was there with President Clinton. He signed a number of bills that I was chief sponsor of, and divided government is kind of the new normal. We've had 80% of the time since 1980, we have had divided government, which means one party controls at least one house of Congress and the other party controls the presidency. And it sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't work. And right now it doesn't seem to be working very well at all. I'm from Northern Virginia, right outside of Washington. Our local professional football team, the Washington football team is what some newspapers call it, but where I come from, we call it the Washington Redskins. And it's gotten so bad in Washington now that Dan Snyder, the owner of the Washington Redskins, is really contemplated changing the name from the Washington Redskins because that name is such animosity and divisiveness and hatred, from just the Washington Redskins to the Redskins. That's how bad it's gotten. So Martin and I started doing, we were head-to-head on some of the talk shows on MSNBC and CNN and some other shows, and we started comparing notes. How did things get this bad? Because you still have a lot of good people in Washington. And we started comparing notes and decided, let's at least put our notes to paper and see if we can get a publisher. And we went out and so we wrote a book about it. We tried to make it understandable for the average person that there actually is a logic to why things don't work. I would add that when one party controls everything, which is the antidote to divided government, voters usually get fed up with that party right away. So the last 3 times we have had one party control the House, the Senate, and the presidency together. That next off-year election, 1994, 2010, 2014, what happens, 2006 and 2010, they sweep the party out of power. Voters really don't like either party. I use the analogy that in 1994, my constituents in Fairfax County, Virginia, elected me. I defeated a Democratic incumbent. They elected me to Congress to protect them from Bill Clinton, and 2 years later, they re-elected Clinton to protect him from me. So what are the macro factors that have occurred that things have gotten so out of whack that we can't seem to get to any agreement or compromise, something I think our founding fathers it really baked into the cake? Well, these are the items, these are the 3 macro factors that have occurred just over the last 15 or 20 years that were not present when I came into office, and really it came kind of post the Clinton years. First, redistricting today is much different than it used to be. We have so many single-party districts. That's part of that is the way that the coalitions are constructed, but a lot of it's the way the districts are drawn. So that for most members of the House now, fully 80% of the House, the only race that matters is the primary election. The general election is just a constitutional formality that the members have to go through. And in any given year, it's more like 10%. But potentially right now, only about 20% of the districts are remotely competitive in November. What does that mean if you're a member of Congress? It means the people that elect me are my primary voters. And by the way, primary voters, they don't applaud compromise, they punish compromise. They want you to stand tough, to stand up for principle. They don't want you to cave in. I think that explains a lot of what's going on in Washington now when you see some of the compromises, or we're going to fund this, or this bill funded this, or whatever. Members worry about their primary voters. The single-party districts have emerged for 3 reasons. Well, number one, redistricting, gerrymandering is now an art form, which I'm going to get to that in a minute. Secondly, the Voting Rights Act basically said you can't discriminate against minorities when you put together districts, but when you pack minorities, who are you packing? You're packing Democrats. And it tends to bleach the districts around that. So in the Deep South today, all we have are white Republican districts and black Democratic districts in the South, with no need to talk to the other side at all because they're irrelevant to your election. It furthers polarization. It doesn't bring us together. And of course, finally, what I call residential sorting patterns. My area in Northern Virginia, what happens are people who think alike live alike in vast enclaves, urban enclaves, rural enclaves, where you couldn't draw in parts of Northern Virginia a Republican seat if you tried. Democrats are just packed into these high rises and living on top of each other, and that's true in most American cities. But if it were just a redistricting problem, you could probably solve it. There are two other macro factors that have emerged over the last 20 years. The media models now that you have are polarizing business models. Don't confuse this with news. These are successful business models. They get to sell a lot of ads. They get the viewership in there. Everybody's making money. It is certainly cable news. It's Fox and it's MSNBC, who, if you ever watch them on anybody ever watch both channels on the same night? Crazy. I mean, it's just different planets, right? Different languages, talking about different things, different value structures, but they cater. They give people their fix every night of what they need to hear, and they have to feed that every night, though, to keep their ratings up. So it's a polarization model, in a sense. Talk radio, the same kind of thing. You know, these contemplative, thoughtful, moderate talk radio guys don't last more than a month. I mean, nobody listens to them. People tune in to what they want to hear. And then finally, the internet. In the internet, we like to say in politics, the crap to content ratio coming over the internet is just very, very, very high. I think so many people believe that President Obama was born in Kenya is because they saw his birth certificate over the internet. I got it, it looked real. I started to believe it myself until one day somebody sent me his birth certificate from Indonesia. And then you start comparing, you say they both can't be right. But the stuff coming over the internet has no filters at all. Anybody can say anything, but people take this off as fact. It's hard to reach compromise when people are arguing with different facts and they're listening to different groups. So that has furthered the polarization. But that's not all. The third factor to emerge is the money in politics. Because in passing McCain-Feingold, the campaign finance reform bill, the theory of this was to get rid of this evil soft money. Large donors, corporate money, get this away from the political parties. They'd gotten rid of it from the candidates a long time ago. But now they're getting rid of it, and the parties couldn't take this money. Martin and I both voted against that bill. We said, well, where do you think this money's going to go? Do you think this money's going to disappear? It's going to find its way back into the process. Well, it has. And with the Supreme Court case of Citizens United, it's come back in droves. And it's moved away from the political parties, which have been a centering force in American politics because they have to compete for the middle. It's moved out to the wings. And so this has basically funneled the left and the right where they can take these large contributions. Much of it is not transparent. Dark money, some people call it, putting it up against people who tend to be more centrist and party-oriented, who have to raise money in smaller increments. And it has disadvantaged them, and it has also moved people out to the wings. I can't tell you how many members have said, look, I don't need some super PAC coming after me on this vote. I'm taking the safe vote. One of the reasons Republicans could only muster a handful of votes for Hurricane Sandy relief is because 3 major super PACs had scored the vote and said, if you vote for this, we're coming after you. So the path of least resistance is to vote no. I had a member call me right before the vote to reopen the government saying, what do I do? He said, I got a primary opponent, a county commissioner. He said, I think I'm fine. I don't think he can get finance, but if these super PACs have all scored this vote, and if I vote to reopen the government and they put some money behind him, I'm going to be scrambling. And I said, well, you know, is it going to pass? He said, yeah, we got the votes to pass it. I said, well, you don't have to vote for it. And he didn't. And the money went away. And but believe me, all these factors combine disciplined behavior in Congress. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. Now, we talked about redistricting. These are, believe it or not, these are congressional districts. This is a voting rights district in North Carolina. This is the 3rd District of Maryland. This is the earmuff district in Chicago. It takes 2 Hispanic pieces of Chicago and binds them together with a freeway. This is Maryland's 2nd district. This is a Republican gerrymander in Pennsylvania. It looks like one dog kicking another dog there. I think if Picasso came back today, he could find out he could be a congressional redistrictor and probably be just as creative as he ever was as an artist. Also, voting today has become much, we have a chapter in our book that says all politics is no longer local. Now, I'm not talking about governor's races or mayor's races, but in legislative races and congressional races, basically, there's a pattern, an almost predictable pattern, where the party is what matters, not the candidate. And we give you a number of case studies of why this is no longer so. And this goes to the Senate races this last time. And if you notice, on the top were the Democratic Senate seats that were up. And as you notice, the better Romney did, the redder these seats went. Here, Arkansas, you're familiar with that, 24-seat loss for 24-seat gain for Romney. These seats they just fell very quickly to the Republicans. Then in districts Romney carried by 5 to 15 points, went Republican. Then in seats that Obama carried by 5 or lost by 5, by the way, only 4 states, in only 4 states was the presidential election within 5 percentage points last time. That's how polarized we've gotten in residential sorting. In that one, Mark Warner, a very close race in Virginia, people were shocked it was so close. Well, when you look at this pattern, there were 2 states where Obama won by more than 5 Republicans took 2 because the off-year turnout model was heavily Republican. It went like this, with only Mark Warner surviving in Virginia by 18,000 votes by about 2%. These votes have become parliamentary races. It's not about the person anymore. Mark Warner, you couldn't find a more popular person in terms of his numbers within the state, but people didn't care. They voted the party. They were voting for a Republican senator. I remember asking my neighbor who liked Mark Warner, I said, what's more important to you, having Mark Warner as your senator or a Republican senator? He said, a Republican Senate. And he just left it. And that's worked. Mark Warner spent a lot of his time in parts of the state that he had never lost before, Southwest Virginia. It helped him 3 or 4 points, but he still lost every county down there. These races have become very, very predictable in terms of how they turn out. Now, what this comes down to at the end is, so what happens when they come to Congress? How do members behave? When I say this is a parliamentary system, voters are voting the party, not the person. They behave as this is a parliamentary system. And Martin will get into this in his remarks in a minute. But what it means is when members are elected because of their party and not because of who they are, when they come to Washington, they behave that way, which means instead of being a member of the minority party, I'm a member of the opposition party. That means I'm no on everything. That's my job, is to be. That's the way they see it. That's the way their constituents see it. And the president's party in Congress, whether they are a majority or a minority, are an appendage of the executive branch, because they feel that their destinies are intertwined. The separation of powers is really gone by the wayside. Congress has lost a lot of power through time because the president's congressional wing is just now an appendage of the executive branch, no matter which party is in power. So National Journal does a survey every year, and they take the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat, and they say how many voters vote between those two. And they call that a very, very broad definition of moderate voters. Well, in 1982, between the most liberal Republican in the House and the most conservative Democrat, there were 344 members. By 1994, this had dropped to 252. By 2002, it had dropped to 137. In the last Congress, it had dropped to 3. And by the way, all 3, 2 retired and 1 was defeated on the Democratic side. They're voting the party, the room for individual conscience, getting nominated and the like, it's just gone. Well, what about the Senate? Senate's traditionally been a little more independent, takes 60 votes to get anything done. Well, in the Senate, in 1982, there were 58 members between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat. By 1994, it had dropped to 34. By 2002, it had dropped to 7. And the last 3 Congresses, it's dropped to nothing. So you understand, I hope this gives you a view of what has happened and how these external factors we talked about have affected voter behavior in Congress by sitting members. regardless of what they think. A lot of good members there, but the disciplining factors that go into their calculations for re-election and the like make it very difficult sometimes to behave as they might otherwise. Now, this, just very quickly, this is the presidential map. As you see, these are states that have voted on the right. We call this the red wall. 13 states have now voted Republican 6 straight times in presidential elections. Democrats, you have 18 states, plus the District of Columbia, have voted Democrat for president 6 straight times. Democrats, 242 electoral votes they start off with. Republicans start off with 102. The electoral map favors the Democrats. Republicans have a path right now, if present trends continue, and to me 6 straight elections is a trend, where their map goes right through Ohio and Florida. These are like must states for Republicans. Democrats have a little more room to maneuver. On the House side, though, the way that the districts are drawn is a huge Republican advantage. In 2012, Democrats got 1.4 million more votes for the House of Representatives than the Republicans, but Republicans had a 17-seat advantage. It's estimated Democrats would have to win by about 4 points to take the House of Representatives, very difficult in a closely divided country. That's the map of the United States by counties of the 2012 election. We just put that up there. Now, I talked about the states that have voted Democrat for president 6 straight times. How are they lining up in the Senate? 32 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 3 of those Republicans were elected in 2010, the biggest Republican off year since 1938. So they're going to be at risk when they come up the next time. But what's happened is, as these states vote in presidential elections, they're also voting in Senate elections, even in off-year elections. The exception to that is Susan Collins from Maine. Maine has a huge independent tradition. The other senator from there caucuses with the Democrats, but is an independent. Ran as an independent, was elected governor as an independent. And Maine is also a small state with not a lot of change, so going home every weekend makes a difference. And Collins is probably the most liberal Republican in the Senate. On the red wall states, the lineup is 25 Republicans, 1 Democrat. The 1 Democrat, Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota, was elected by less than 1% last time and is thinking of running for governor. It's 2016, as you can see, these are Republican seats up, Democrat seats. Republicans have 24 seats up, 7 of them in states that President Obama carried, some that he carried substantially. These will be at risk. So the Senate is at risk for Republicans coming up, which means that Mitch McConnell has a different job trying to hold his majority than Boehner, who doesn't worry about holding a majority. Boehner can cater to the hardliners in his party who control his caucus, who are worried about the primaries. But McConnell has to worry about Mark Kirk in Illinois. He has to worry about Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania. He has to worry about members who are running in these blue states and not go too far over, or he'll lose them. But more importantly, he'll lose control of the floor. He wants to get them elected. So you can see even the Republicans theoretically they're not in control of both. Nobody controls the Senate. One party presides over the Senate. But the parties that are the majorities their leaders have kind of different views going into this session. We're already seeing that clash very early in what's going on. And that is it. That's my intro, and I'm going to turn it over now to Martin Frost, my distinguished colleague. Martin, I think in his introduction, said served for many years from Texas and was a very successful chairman of the Democratic Campaign Committee. I'll say one thing for him. Only 3 times in history has the president's party picked up seats in a midterm election. One was 1998 when Martin chaired the DCCC. I was sitting there that year as recruitment chair at the Republican Committee. We thought we were going to pick up 15 seats. We ended up losing seats on election night. And we gave Martin all the credit or the blame, depending how you look at it. Martin, thanks.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I've spent a little time over the years in Little Rock. I have a cousin here whom some of you know, Rabbi Eugene Levy. Gene. My wife accuses me of having more relatives than Osama bin Laden. It seems everywhere we go, I have a relative. It just turns out that way. I was elected to Congress from Dallas in 1978 and served for 26 years. And a lot of you are familiar with Dallas. I represented basically a racially mixed district in the southern and western part of Dallas, the city of Dallas and Dallas County. I had blacks, I had Hispanics, I had blue-collar whites, and it was an interesting district, and I served for 13 terms. And then the Texas legislature chopped, Tom DeLay convinced the Texas legislature to radically redraw the Texas districts, and mine was one, and the legislature chopped my district into 5 pieces. And so to run, I had to pick one of those 5 pieces. I did pick one, but it was not one I could be reelected in. So I'm now on the outside looking in, but it was an interesting experience. I loved every minute of being in Congress, as did Tom. This can be a great job. It has changed dramatically in recent years. I've been out now for 10 years, and I'll comment a little bit about that. Tom is the one who has all the good stories, but I have one. Years ago, I was visiting with a friend of mine from Miami who had been elected to Congress from the city of Miami. His name was Bill Lehman, and Bill had been a used car dealer before being elected to Congress. And Bill said he didn't think he could fall any lower in public esteem when he was a used car dealer, and then he became a congressman. And that was when Congress's ratings was in the 40s. They may have mentioned in the introduction when Tom and I were in the other room, but there was a poll last summer that showed congressional approval at 7%. Now that's family and friends. And employees, and that's about it. So we now are at a situation where Congress is held in very low public esteem. That's not good for our country. And it doesn't make any difference whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. You don't want the public thinking so ill about its government. Now, Tom's gone through some of the reasons why this has happened, and it's one of the reasons that we wrote this book. And I'm going to offer some of the solutions we have and talk a little bit about a few other things, and then we'll take questions. And I don't know if you all are set up for people to ask questions if they can go to a mic, but if not, we'll ask you to ask them loudly so we make sure we hear. Because of this high ceiling, the acoustics may not be great. Some of the things that Tom and I have looked at over a period of years and made some recommendations are, one starts with the way districts are drawn. And Tom went through this. Basically, in the last 2 elections leading up to congressional redistricting, in the year 2000 and the year 2010, the Republicans were very successful in electing people to state legislatures all over the country and electing governors. And so they were able to draw districts pretty much at will. Now, I'm not going to suggest that this is only thing that's done by the Republicans. Democrats had done that in the past in some states too, so it's not just the Republicans drawing these funny-looking districts, but they were particularly successful in the redistricting of 2001 and of 2011, and that's why you now have a situation where the Democrats got more votes in 2012, 1.4 million, as Tom pointed out, and yet Republicans carried the House by 17 seats. And so the question is, do we want to change the system, the way districts are drawn, so that you're closer to the actual vote in terms of who controls Congress? Because there have been very few times in our history where one party has carried a majority of the vote and yet lost the congressional races. We've suggested that we ought to seriously look at, in fact, we recommend, Congress passing a law requiring states to adopt nonpartisan commissions to draw congressional districts. Now, there's no guarantee that these would all be competitive districts, but at least they wouldn't be as funny looking as the ones that Tom showed you, and there's a chance there would be more competitive districts state by state. There are 5 states that currently have nonpartisan commissions: California, Arizona, Iowa, New Jersey, and Washington, state of Washington. California has an unusual addition to that, in that in addition to drawing districts by commission, they also have an open primary system the way Louisiana has over the years, where everybody runs regardless of party. And so that the top 2 candidates then are in a runoff, regardless of party, and you could have 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans running against each other. What that does, if you were to take both the nonpartisan districts and the California add-on to that, then you have a system where if you have 2 Democrats running against each other in the runoff, they have to talk to the other side. They have to talk to Republicans, because it'll be the Republicans who will provide the margin of victory for one of the 2 Democrats. And the same thing if you had 2 Republicans, and this has actually happened in California in the last round of elections, they have to talk to the Democrats. So you can argue whether this makes sense. Some people like the California system, some people don't. We're not suggesting you have to go to that kind of system even if you do have nonpartisan districts. The result of this, by having all these safe districts, 80% members reelected, is that, as Tom pointed out, members are more concerned about their primary. Now, very few members actually lose in primaries. That's not the result, but members are so concerned that they change their voting pattern in the time leading up to the election, so they won't have a primary challenge. And the best example was a friend of mine, Pat Roberts, from the state of Kansas, United States Senator, and he's a Republican. I served with him in the House for many years, and then he went over to the Senate and was elected. And in this last election, he had a Tea Party opponent in the general election. Now, his opponent was not particularly strong, but the Tea Party was strong. And so Pat altered his voting record, moved hard right, would never be seen even talking to Democrats, literally, certainly would not try and do anything on a bipartisan basis. He was reelected. And he's not the only one that has followed that particular pattern in recent years. So the way the districts are set up discourages bipartisanship, discourages meeting in the middle. Now, all we have to do is, people will say, well, hasn't it always been that way? The answer is no, it has not always been that way. And what happened this last weekend is the reminder of that. In both 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, and in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, it was passed by a coalition of Democrats and Republicans. Lyndon Johnson was president. However, at that time, there were a lot of very conservative Southern Democrats in the United States Senate. That's not the case anymore, but there were at that time. Enough that they could filibuster, and that you couldn't override a filibuster just with Democratic votes. And for those of you who've read the Caro books on Lyndon Johnson, he describes in the 3rd book in that series of how Lyndon Johnson went to Everett McKinley Dirksen, the Republican leader of the Senate from Illinois, and romanced Everett McKinley Dirksen for months and months, and would say, Ev, you're from the land of Lincoln. You have to be for civil rights. And ultimately, Everett McKinley Dirksen, the Republican leader of the Senate, provided the votes to break the Southern filibuster against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and against the Voting Rights Act of 65. The Voting Rights Act was more dramatic because you had what happened in Selma, and you had the impetus was all on the side of passing it. But in passing the Civil Rights Act of 64, that was not a foregone conclusion that was going to pass, that it would be possible to break a Southern filibuster. And it was a bipartisanship that made that possible. There are other examples of bipartisanship in recent years, much less so now, almost none these days. But so it would be nice if members felt like they could work with the other side. That's one approach that you could do by changing the way members of the House are reelected. Secondly is the campaign finance laws. Now, Tom indicated that both of us were opposed to McCain-Feingold, and the reason this was viewed as the Great Reform, past 2001, 2002. And all the editorials were for it. Everybody said, oh, I've got to vote. I would go argue with members, and I'd say, oh, this is going to weaken political parties. What McCain-Feingold did was to take corporate contributions and labor union contributions and large individual contributions away from political parties. Say those were banned to political parties, and that was somehow going to be a great reform. The problem with that is that money finds its own level. It's like water, and so that we all knew that money was going to go someplace if it was taken away from political parties, and the problem was it was going to the extremes. It was going to these fringe groups that now raise millions and millions of dollars and can come in at the last moment and try and defeat someone, and people are very concerned about that. So Tom and I suggested, well, you know, we don't want to do this. We don't want to destroy political parties in the name of reform. And members would say, don't, you know, listen, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and not the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times and the Washington Post and my hometown newspaper are all saying, pass this great reform. How can I be anti-reform? And we would respond to them, you don't understand what this is going to do to our political process. And they would basically say, don't bother me with the details. So literally, don't bother me with the details. And so Congress passed McCain-Feingold. The inevitable result happened is that the parties were weakened and that all these groups on the extremes suddenly it was possible for them to raise a lot of money, and then the United States Supreme Court further complicated the situation in the Citizens United case by saying that none of the restrictions put on by McCain-Feingold against the use of corporate money, because there were some restrictions. It couldn't be used within 60 days of a general election or 30 days of a primary. None of those restrictions count anymore, that the right to contribute is a free speech issue, and now corporations, unions, and wealthy individuals can give any amount they want to these C4s, these outside organizations, and they are not required to report that money to the Federal Election Commission. So you now have the worst of all worlds. Political parties, which were required to report every penny to the Federal Election Commission, can no longer accept that money, and the outside groups, which have never been required, because they're regulated by the IRS, not by the FEC, never been required to report these large the contributors, can do it under the cloak of darkness. And so you now have, in fact, the Koch brothers and other people in a position where they can threaten a member, and they're not the only ones. They can threaten a member, we're going to get you in the primary if you don't agree with our agenda. And so members, again, in addition to having districts where they're worried about being challenged by a well-organized, vocal extreme group in the way their district is drawn, they now are also worried about money being spent against them. So what we've suggested is that Congress pass a law, which it could do, requiring that any organization of any kind which mentions a federal candidate by name during the election cycle, anytime during the 2 years leading up to the election, has to report all its donors to the FEC. Now, can that pass Congress? The answer to that is it is not particularly likable because people who are currently in office like the system that they were elected under, and they're not going to change the rules. And yes, unless there were some sort of great public outcry, and there may be. I mean, this has gone to such extremes that you may have a real strong movement for full disclosure. Let's hope that's the case. Now, Tom mentioned about parliamentary voting, the way people voting a straight ticket. Under a parliamentary system, Great Britain and other European countries, you have unitary government. Whichever party or coalition of parties controls the parliament automatically gets the prime minister, so that you don't have split government the way we do. But people in our country are voting as if it were a parliamentary system, but that's not the way our system operates. So you don't have unitary government. They go in and they vote straight Democratic or straight Republican, and they think that that's what the government they're going to get, and that's not the government they get. They may get that government in the House or in the Senate, but they don't necessarily get that as for president because of the way the Electoral College operates. So we have kind of a very strange situation on our hands. We're not going to change our system, our fundamental system. We're not going to go to a parliamentary system where whichever party controls the Congress automatically gets the presidency. That's not going to happen. And yet voters are acting as if that's the kind of system we had. They're not considering the merits or the program of individual candidates anymore. If the districts were different and people had to campaign differently, maybe they would. We've also suggested several other things. One is going to a national primary day for Congress, not for president. States could have presidential primaries whenever they wanted to, but that every primary for the U.S. House and for U.S. Senate, anywhere in the country would be on the same day. And so what this would do, it would focus more media attention on the primaries. Primaries are very low turnout in most cases. That's why such a well-organized, well-financed, extreme group can control a primary. If you had a national primary day with more media attention, maybe you'd have a larger turnout. Maybe people would pay attention to what's going on and more people would vote. One of the problems is that in some states, You can't vote unless you're registered in a particular party. Now, that's not the case in a lot of southern states. In most southern states, you don't register by party. You can show up and vote in either primary. But there are a number of states in the country outside the South where you do register by party, and if you register as an independent, you can't vote in either party's primary. So it would be up to the states to change that, to permit people who are independents to vote in whatever party primary they wanted to. But it would be nice if we had a national primary day so that you'd have a larger turnout. One of the other things that we've suggested, and not all these suggestions here are major monumental things that we expect to happen overnight or that we maybe even think might happen overnight. We've looked at our whole media situation, and there really are very few things you can do about right-wing media or left-wing media. I'm a reporter. I started off as a journalist, have a degree in journalism, and I'm not for censorship. I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe you could consider bringing back the fairness doctrine where you have some sort of equal amount of time for candidates of both parties rather than being able to just have a one-sided view on television or on radio. I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon. And there are other things that we could consider. We didn't attempt to address the filibuster rule. That's something that reformers always like to talk about, but that's got to be resolved by the Senate. We're not suggesting that that be changed, at least in any significant way. And there are other recommendations that we've made, and I would urge you to read what we have to say, and please ask us questions. We'll be glad to respond to those. If you're interested in getting the book, we do have some over here, and we'll be happy to sign it afterwards. And also, if you don't get a book today for whatever reason and you think about it later, you can get it on Amazon, or you can get it. There are lots of places where you can get our book. We're having a good time with this. We are going from here to Austin, where we're going to speak at the LBJ School. And then we're going to Houston, where we're going to speak at Rice and at the University of Houston. And then we're coming back to Dallas, and we're going to speak at the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas. And then we're going out to Tucson for a big book event they have in Tucson. They have people from all over the state come in. And previously, we've spoken at the Nixon Library and the Reagan Library in California. We've spoken at USC. We've spoken at Stanford. This is interesting for us. It's a serious subject. We enjoy talking to people about it, and we wrote the book in such a way that we think it's easy to read. It has a lot of charts in it. Tom's very fond of charts. I'm less fond of charts, but we think it's easy to read. We wrote it for people who are interested in politics, who aren't necessarily practitioners, not people who run campaigns, but people who follow politics and want to try and understand what's happening in our country, and hopefully for students too. Tom and I each teach classes. I teach a class at GW, at George Washington University. He teaches at George Mason. We use our book in the class, and our book's being used in some other classes around the country right now. So Tom, you want to come back up here, and we'll both stand up here, and we'll be glad to take questions.
Yeah, I'll just moderate. All right, we do have time for some questions. If you would please raise your hand, and we'll get the microphone to you. Ramirez, right back here.
Hello, my name is Ramirez Biddle. I'm a Class 9 student here at the Clinton School, and we really do appreciate you all coming down and visiting with us and speaking with us. My question to both of you, my capstone project is to create a student state government, and maybe one day this could be repeated throughout the other states and maybe have a national student state government. I would like for it to be nonpartisan so that people can actually work together. The goal is to create a new class of public servants through public policy, and so my question to you is, what advice would you give me to create the best possible program that could prepare the new class of public servants in public policy to answer the questions that are coming up very soon in the near future, like Social Security, foreign policy, things of that nature?
Well, they have a couple things. They have something called Boys State and Boys Nation, which I think you were aware of. In fact, President Clinton went to Boys State in Arkansas and then to Boys Nation. That's where his famous picture was taken, where he met John F. Kennedy, that I think he was inspired to get into politics before that, but that's what they used to get in. I think also getting a program where they can get internships in government. There is nothing like working for a member, working in the legislature, working for somebody in county government to understand how it actually operates. I think there's a bit of naivete on the part of the average citizen in terms of how the sausage making of government and how it actually works. And if you want to get a class of people who want to stay interested and active, get them involved early with some kind of internships in people who are in government and decision makers, or even on campaigns. I think it gives you a real eye view. Sometimes the ideal isn't quite, the ideal we hear about government isn't quite what it actually is, but participating in that gives them an understanding of trying to make it work.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
And let me just add one thing. And of course, I knew by the time I got out of law school, I went, as I said, I had an undergraduate degree in journalism, and then I went to law school and went back to Texas. I knew that I was going to someday, at least I hoped I was someday going to run for office. And what I did was to get involved in campaigns at the local level. I volunteered in campaigns for the city council, school board, state legislature in Dallas. And I did this for two reasons. One, I wanted to understand about how grassroots politics operate. And two, I wanted the political people to know who I was. So when I later decided to run for office, they wouldn't say, who is this guy? We've never heard of him before. But that really doesn't answer your question. Your question is, I think Tom has responded to that, is try and get people involved in government and in campaigns, even if they're never going to run for office, at an early age, to get some sense for how the system operates and how they can maybe make a difference in the system.
I think following up on that comment, one of our issues that you've mentioned is the lack of participation by voters. Look at our younger citizens as they come along, how they live, where their information comes from. What's your feeling about having elections where you can have online voting?
Online voting? I don't know. Not mail voting, but online.
And I'm just skeptical. I mean, they get into cybersecurity into every aspect. They get into your bank accounts now, identity theft, and so on. It just could wreak havoc. I don't think we're at the point right now where I would trust online voting. A couple states have gone to mandatory mail voting, Oregon and Colorado, which has increased turnout. But let me give you something on the other side. I'm somebody who, Martin talked about how he was gerrymandered out of his seat by, I left politics undefeated and unindicted. I had just been there. I've been in office 29 years. It was just time to do something else and stuff. I worry sometimes about people voting and don't know what they're voting on. I think that's a greater fear of mine than trying to get everybody out there because they vote on all kinds of goofy things. We could do better in voter education. And the previous question from the gentleman in the back about getting kids organized early on, interested in this, I think is the best way to do that. Through high school, having really good government and civics classes, having people who want to participate, get them in, I think is our best antidote for that.
Yeah, I'm skeptical about online voting because of security issues. I will tell you this, when I teach a course at, as I mentioned, at GW, a graduate course, and at the beginning of the first class, I asked students in the class, how many of you read newspapers? Nobody. Nobody in the class reads a newspaper. They have the Washington Post and the New York Times. They're going to school in Washington. It's easy to get both papers. Now, they read the papers online. They read the papers online, so they say. But then I will occasionally bring articles in, an article from the front page of the New York Times and from the op-ed page or the first section of the Washington Post on subjects that we have been talking about in my class. And I'll pass those copies out, and I'll say, well, how many of you have read these articles? These were articles in the last day or two. These are the students who say they're reading newspapers online, and I'm sure they do read some of the newspapers online, but half of the students had not read the article. Was the lead article in the New York Times that Sunday. I teach my class on Mondays. and it was exactly on point on something we had been talking about in the last couple of weeks in my class. So I am a little concerned about how much information young people get these days, even though there's an awful lot of information available online. I'm very old-fashioned. I like to see a hard copy of a newspaper. My wife likes to see the hard copy of the newspaper. She sits around, she's retired now, and she reads the paper cover to cover, and she's always finding things that I missed, either events that are coming up in Washington that we should go to, or sometimes even in a story because it wasn't on the front page or wasn't on the op-ed page. In the Washington Post, people have advised me, read the society section. There's more political news in the society section of the Washington Post than any other part of the paper, anyway. And she reads that every day.
Right back here. Katie?
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. You talked about the need for a political outcry in regards to the money in politics. Do you see any states where there's grassroots movements that are making progress, or are we all kind of on the same playing field?
Well, Tom is very much involved in an organization called No Labels. Some of you may have heard of that, and I don't know if, Tom, if you can talk about that.
But, you know, look, I think the money in politics, because of the court decisions going back to Buckley versus Vallejo and others, where an individual can spend as much of their own money on their campaign as they want. That's free speech. If to limit that is to limit speech, and the court said you can't do that. I think the best thing is to just, you kind of regulate it by making it transparent. And I think if you do that, if everything has to be transparent, then everything's equal. And I'd let the parties raise the money they used to and get it out. Some of the money that's going to these groups, people would rather give to the parties. And that tends to be a little more centrist in this. So I'd kind of go back to where it was a little bit. I don't think you can put the genie back in the bottle at this point. We did have, as you know, and Martin and I, we get into arguments on this, but we had, as you know, matching funds for federal races, where you were limited in what you could spend for president. You'd have to raise a certain amount, and the federal government would match you. But that went out the window when Barack Obama decided not to take the federal money and found he could raise a lot more money than he could from the match.
And George W. Bush before him made the same
Well,
mistake.
Bush did it in the primary. I told you we get to it's who's to blame. Bush didn't do it in the general election. He just did it in the primary. And so Obama had a 2-to-1 spending advantage in the general. So that's not to criticize. People are going to do what they're going to do, and they're going to act in their own interest. And I think that's what politicians do. I think we all recognize that. So I think the best thing is to make sure that this money is duly recorded in a timely manner. So if you're taking money from some sinister group, I mean, I always said, you want to know how somebody's going to vote, follow the money. And I used it in my first campaign for Congress. I ran on NAFTA. I was in a very technology-oriented, wealthy suburban district that is culturally pretty liberal, but economically it was more conservative, and I beat a Democrat on her NAFTA vote. She voted against it. And we just looked at all of her labor votes and put it together. We got the Washington Post endorsement, and that was the end of her. I think you can do that well. I did it in my supervisor campaigns when I was on the county board on development money and tying it to rezonings. If you're smart about this, you can use this. That's a lost art now because it's all dark money and we don't know where it's going to. But I think voters have a right to know that and let the parties take it and let the chips fall where they may.
It's not all dark money, but a lot of it is, just to be clear on that. And it would be nice if it all had to be disclosed. Now, Tom is a partisan Republican. I'm a partisan Democrat. And we agree on a lot of things. We don't agree on every single thing. But this is such a fundamental issue in terms of, and let me explain why. Some of you here probably get emails every day. I do. Lots of emails from political candidates, and they'll say, give me money so that we can pass legislation repealing Citizens United. Well, that's a disingenuous request for money, and some of my friends are the people making that request today. You can't pass legislation repealing a Supreme Court decision. If you want to undo a Supreme Court decision, you have to amend the U.S. Constitution. And it is damn hard to amend the U.S. Constitution. It takes a 2/3 vote of each House of Congress. It has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. That's why we have so few amendments to our Constitution. That's been a strength of our government, is that we're not a banana republic. Somebody can't ride into town on a white horse one day and want to change everything. It's hard to make change in our country. But because it's hard to make change, it is very difficult to overcome a Supreme Court decision you disagree with. You have two choices. You have to hope for a change of the court, new people on the court appointed by a president. Not likely to happen anytime soon, quite frankly. And then, short of that, you have to amend the Constitution, which is damn hard to do. So just buyer beware. When you get an email from one of my Democratic friends asking you to send money so that they can repeal Citizens United, they can't do it without a constitutional amendment.
All right, now I'm going to put you guys on the spot because I know that you agree on a lot of stuff, but there's some things you don't agree, and it probably would be your choices in 2016. So would you assess right now, I know it's early, and you can tell your class story if you want to, Congressman Frost, and you can tell your theory, Congressman Davis. I hope you do. So would you look at 2016 and give us your early prognostication?
Yeah, I'll start. I obviously think that Hillary is a strong candidate. I think that if she runs for the presidency, she will be the Democratic nominee, despite all the noise you're having right now. Now, she could always have health problems, or there could be some other serious disclosures which could sidetrack her, but right now, she will be the Democratic nominee. She is not a foregone conclusion for a general election victory. Now, the Republicans could nominate a bad candidate, a weak candidate. If they nominate a respectable candidate, it will be a very, very competitive, tough race. As we mentioned before, you've only had a 3-term presidency for one party once since World War II. And so this would be the 3rd term of a Democratic presidency. I told this story earlier to a small group. I teach a course at George Washington on partisan elections. And the final assignment for my class this semester was for the students, and there were 21 students. We divided them into teams of 3. So we're going to have 7 3-person teams. We couldn't have, because you have to do an oral presentation in addition to a written presentation. And their assignment was to write a memo for the candidate of the campaign manager of the candidate of their choice. Both in terms of how to win the nomination and how to win the general election. And they submitted these to me in writing, and I looked at all of them, and I was surprised. This is a class made up of some young people right out of undergraduate school, some people a little bit older who worked on the Hill for a while, some people who are a little bit older than that who've been in the military and then coming back to school, but it was a very mixed class, but tilted young. The campaigns that my students, and they're both Democrats and Republicans in the class, wanted to write on. 2 of the teams wanted to write on Jeb Bush. 2 of the teams wanted to write on Marco Rubio. 2 of the teams wanted to write on Elizabeth Warren. And 1 of the teams wanted to write on Rand Paul. Nobody chose Hillary. Now, what does that tell me? Does that tell me, one, they just think it's a foregone conclusion and it wouldn't be a very interesting paper because they couldn't talk about how she wins the nomination, they would have to just all talk about the general election? Or does it mean that Hillary has a problem among young people? Is there a generational problem here? I'm not sure what the answer is, but if I were in Hillary's campaign right now, and I'm not, they haven't asked me for my advice, if I were in her campaign, I think I'd focus a lot on how do I maintain the level of enthusiasm and turnout among young people that Obama had in 2008 and 2012? Because his coalition, larger than normal turnout among African Americans, larger than normal turnout among young people, Hispanics, some white college graduates, and single women in the suburbs. That was his coalition. And if any of that coalition falls off, and if the Republicans nominate a strong candidate, particularly one who might have some appeal in the Hispanic community, because they really took a bath among Hispanics in the last election, Hillary could have a very tough general election campaign. I still think she can win. I'm for her, and I'll do everything I can. But it's not a foregone conclusion she's going to be the next president.
Well, Hillary's campaign hasn't asked me to do anything either, Mara. But let me see if I can, I don't know if I can print up, get the map up. Let me just see if I. Anyway, I was going to, just to go back to the blue wall and the red wall and what we talked about. The last presidential election was really about 8 or 9 states. You only had 4 states that were decided within 5 percentage points, and this has been consistently building over 20-some years. So if it's a remotely competitive race, this will boil down to a handful of states where the Republicans have their victory goes right through Ohio and Florida, which is why Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio look so attractive. Maybe John Kasich, the governor of Ohio. I think that Hillary Clinton's, and I'm respectful of where I'm speaking, so I will say she's clearly the best qualified in terms of a governmental experience, having been Secretary of State, which is a traditional path to the presidency, and having been in the Senate. Well, but I'm just saying, but that's, you've had a number of presidents were Secretary of States, and that's how they got their some of them had never held office outside of that. And then her years in the Senate, and of course her years as First Lady. I don't think Republicans can match that experience level, and I'm not sure that voters particularly value that. In fact, today, experience is almost a negative with some people. You know, they're part of the problem, they've been in Washington too long. How often do you hear that? Republican problem is, are they going to nominate a mammal? Are they going to nominate somebody that is basically going to be acceptable to a wider berth of the electorate than the narrow party base? They have had that problem in some states where they've nominated candidates that just can't win. But assuming they do that, otherwise you go the way of a Goldwater or a McGovern and it becomes a wipeout. And I think Republicans are capable of doing that, in which case the general election won't matter. I am not sure that Bush could get nominated at this point. You have a huge anti-establishment element within the Republican Party, of which Bush symbolizes, not Jeb, but just the Bush name, saying, do we really need a third Bush? That people are not looking at him, and the current polls reflect that, that he's running as well as he is, second nationally, because of the name ID as much as anything else. But everybody knows the Bush name. Nobody knows Scott Walker, who's running ahead. Rand Paul, I think, is an intriguing candidate because he brings in new elements to the party. But my guess is that Bush is going to have a hard time being nominated, given the current makeup of the Republican Party. I think there are other candidates who can be very viable along the way, and I think there's some candidates that can't be viable. So I think a year and a half out, it's impossible to say where things are. I'm keeping my powder dry at this point in terms of where I get into the race, and I expect to be involved at some point. But my state of Virginia has turned from a pretty red state, all of a sudden it's purple with a blue tinge. Most of that growth is in the area that I represented as county executive in Fairfax and in Congress for 7 terms. I never had a close race, but Republicans have been losing those areas because they haven't been able to appeal to basically multi-ethnic educated groups that have coming in. And I think that's going to be, have a candidate that can do that. So look, campaigns matter. People look good on paper, but they go out and say something stupid. And we had a senator who said macaca one day, and that was the end of him. He'd been governor and everything else. So campaigns will matter in a presidential race in those sliver of states, those 10 states that will decide the electorate.
I'm going to ask you all a trivia question. Let's see if anybody, and some of you may know this. No fair looking it up on your phone or your iPad. In the 20th century, there were only 3 sitting current United States senators who were elected president. So the path to the presidency is not a United States Senate seat in most cases. I'll give you 2 of them. 2 of them are easy. John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Barack Obama. They were current senators when they were elected president. Anybody know who the 3rd sitting senator who was elected president in the 20th century? Harding, Warren Harding. That's right, not exactly shining light. So that there is not, look at anybody who's in the Senate right now and kind of say, I don't think so. It's kind of unusual for a sitting senator to be elected president.
Well, let's thank the 2 congressmen for being here.
I think Obama's a shining light, but I'm ready to say